This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The sons of God, in the New Testament, they appear to be the faithful followers of Jesus Christ. But does that phrase, the English phrase, mean the same thing in the Old Testament, and specifically in Genesis 6, verse 4? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. It's our monthly Iron and Myth roundtable discussion, and joining me, the regular panel of miscreants and fringe theologians, or at least that's what artificial intelligence bots call us. The sons of God, in the New Testament, they appear to be the faithful followers of Jesus Christ. But does that phrase, the English phrase, mean the same thing in the Old Testament, and specifically in Genesis 6, verse 4? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. It's our monthly Iron and Myth roundtable discussion, and joining me, the regular panel of miscreants and fringe theologians, or at least that's what artificial intelligence bots call us. The author of Giants Sons of the Gods, the 10th anniversary revised and expanded edition, the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder, Doug Van Dorn, best-selling author, award-winning screenwriter, his latest theological thriller, Cruel Logic, but also let's see, I just got a ding in my ear, which means I've got to put all my stuff on Do Not Disturb. All right, there we go. Nonfiction we recommend, as well as Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, Chronicles of the Apocalypse series of novels, Brian Godawa, and the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and author of Interview with the Giant Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, Dr. Judd Burton. Fellows, welcome. And this almost seems like an Iron and Myth 101 topic, but I think we may have, or at least I know I can be guilty at times of thinking that everybody knows what's already inside my head. But Sharon has informed me that that is not the case. So in dealing with the Genesis 6 worldview, one of the criticisms that we run into is that the verse in Genesis 6, verse 4 doesn't mean what it appears to plainly say. And the verse in the ESV reads, the Nephilim,
yeah, what we're trying to do on these few
on
debunking episodes is to try to fairly depict the view that opposes ours, or several views that may oppose ours, and try to present them fairly,
who are those sons of God?
And to address them,
because I know what we think, but there are
in
those
many
who
ways,
think otherwise.
And being
Brian,
able to
the
answer objections
Sethite
to your
view,
own
which was
view,
popularized by Augustine in the 5th century. What is that, and how is that used to explain away the
objections to
supernatural
your view
in
is one of
Genesis
the
6,
most
verse 4?
helpful things, I think, for education. I know it is for me. When I read books or listen to talks, someone explaining a view, even one that I agree with, there's all kinds of questions. I'm like, yeah, but this guy says that against it, and what do you have to say about that? And I think sometimes we forget that because we get so into our positive presentation of our view. So, yeah, I'm going to give a stab at, trying to keep this as brief as possible so we can address it. But the Sethite view, like as you mentioned, Augustine made it popular, but Julius Africanus in about, 3rd century, mid-3rd century was one that sort of originated it. But if we read Genesis 6:1, we see when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, the key phrase, saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then, of course, the verse you mentioned as well, related to the Nephilim. We're going to try to focus on the sons of God right now. Who are these sons of God? Are they the angelic or divine beings that our view holds, the supernatural view, or are they humans in some way? And there's some pretty good, theological reasoning that some people attempt to explain. No, the sons of God are not divine, supernatural, or angelic beings. They are actually humans. And particularly, it's a description, sons of God is a description about particularly those from the line of Seth. And in order to understand this, you got to go back a little bit in Genesis, back to Genesis 4. And you hear the Cain and Abel story. And of course, Cain kills Abel, right? And then we've got, God's mark on Cain. And we see that sort of judgment coming down. They get kicked out of Eden, right? Yeah. And then the first city is created, right? Well, in Genesis 4, the line of Cain is described, and as well as the line of Abel is described after that. But the line of Cain is described, and most of the context in this view, the Sethite view, that again I'm going to try to be fair to it and try to depict it honestly and fairly. So the idea here is that the line of Cain is a negative bloodline. It's a line that reflects Cain's own, right? Cain murdered Abel, so he represents that line of unrighteousness. And sure enough, when you read through that, you see these various figures. And Enoch, Irad, Mehujalel, Methuselah, and he ends up fathering Lamech. And Lamech there's taken some time to describe Lamech. And Lamech says in chapter 4, verse 19, that Lamech took 2 wives. It's important to understand that phrase, took 2 wives. That taking wives is the same phrase that we see later, that the sons of God that we just read, the sons of God took wives as their own. So is there a connection here, right? And Lamech is described as being quite an evil man. We've got these descriptions of, tent dwellers and musical players, but then it talks about Lamech having 2 wives, and he said to his 2 wives, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And the idea here is that this line it starts with that Cain the murderer, and it culminates in Lamech, who's this, if you think God's going to judge someone for, if they hurt Cain, well, I'm going to be avenged 70 times, or 77-fold, right? And also he's polygamous. This is the first mention of polygamy where he has 2 wives, and it's spoken of negatively in terms of using that phrase, took 2 wives, right? And so the idea here is that this bloodline of Cain is unrighteous. It talks about, but then it says, and Adam knew his wife and bore a son, called his name Seth. And she said, God has appointed for me, that's what the meaning of Seth means, appointed, for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth was born another man. And then it says, at that time of the son of Seth, whose name was Enosh, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And then after that, then in Genesis 5, we then see the generations of Seth's line. So the idea here is that Cain destroyed the righteous line of Abel, so God replaced it with the righteous line of Seth. And then this phrase in 4:26, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord, in contrast to what we were reading about Cain. Now we see, this line of Seth that was born is connected to that notion of the people who are calling upon the name of the Lord. And in Hebrew, it's the name Yahweh. People began to call upon the name of Yahweh. So that's where there's this connection of the 2 lines, and one's righteous and one is unrighteous, right? And so there might be more going on in Genesis 5, but then when you get down to Genesis 6, then it says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took wives. So they believe then that the connection here is that the sons of God then is a phrase that means, true believers or righteous line, right? Because they're sons of God, of Elohim. And that the daughters of man then, so that's the sons of God then is a metaphor or phrase that refers to that righteous line of Seth, the sons of Seth. And the daughters of man then are those women who are in the line of Cain. Cain, and they were the unrighteous line. And so the idea here is that what they believe Scripture is saying is this is a similar concept to what we read about later. Now, don't forget Moses is writing this, or editors who have adapted as well. This is after the fact, after the law of God has been given. And so this is a reflecting, sort of a foreshadowing, I guess, of the holiness separation that God wants to take place with his people and unbelievers, right? Because we know in the future, God says, don't marry unbelievers if you're an Israelite, right? Because that will be sin, etc. So they believe that this is a foreshadowing of that future reality of separation that should be taking place. But in this case, it's a negative thing because they're violating that separation, and that therefore the separation, so the blood, those men from the bloodline of Seth, who are supposed to only marry within the righteous line, are violating it and marrying daughters from the line of Cain, and that's that pollution taboo that's reflecting that violation of God's separating of the holy, of true believers and holiness versus unbelievers. That's the kind of concept that, as I understand it, and there might be more elements. Maybe you guys can help fill out if I've missed some of the components, but that's why they believe that that the sons of God are not the divine entities that we've talked about, but this can be explained in a more of a naturalistic way that also reinforces the notion that is the themes that are strong in the Old Testament, which include faith, faithfulness, the people of God, holiness, and separation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was looking at the theologian John Murray, who was, Brian, kind of in our tradition, taught at Westminster Theological Seminary back in the 40s, 50s. In fact, I think he helps start the thing when Princeton went so liberal. He gives 7 arguments, and these are a little bit there. It's important to bring this up because some of them are grammatical and they're actually there in the Genesis 6 story. You've given kind of the background with Genesis 4 and 5 and in that, but he gives a few others. So I'll just kind of, I won't go into them in detail, but I will mention them. Oh, by the way, Judd, pregnant with meaning. I wore this just for you, my friend.
Thank you, my friend.
So you can tell me if any of this is pregnant with meaning or what kind of meaning it is when we're done with it. So his first one is that looking at the actual grammar that Brian read earlier, he says there's nothing in the grammar itself that demands that you have to have different classes of beings, only that you have to have different class within human beings. And so that class
Doug
there would
wins
be
the shirts
something
this
like the
month.
godly versus the ungodly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he gives that context of two humanities that are being set up, and rightfully so. I mean, the 2 chapters right before this are talking about these 2 lines. His third argument is that there's just this horrific departure from God's ordinance of marriage, and Brian brought that up with how important this connection is with Lamech, and how he had taken these wives, and how this is the normal language for taking a wife. Mm-hmm. Another one that he brings up is that the Bible doesn't present angels as capable of sexual intercourse. Now, somebody who was blogging Murray's view, rightly so, says this one's a bit weaker because it's an argument really from silence. But nevertheless, the point is that the Bible does not tell us anywhere that the angels can do this. The idea of marriage itself is at stake is a 5th one, and Brian just went over that. And then I think this one is a very important one. The Bible uses sons of God far more for the natural view than anything supernatural. This is the argument that's being said. So he gives passages like Exodus 4:22 and 23. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go. Or Deuteronomy 14:1, you are the sons of the Lord your God. Or Deuteronomy, this one's interesting because it's just a couple verses before the Deuteronomy 32:8. Deuteronomy 32:5 and 6. They are no longer his sons because they're blemished. Is not he your father who created you? Psalm 73:15. If I had said I will speak thus, I would have betrayed the generation of your sons. He brings Psalm 82:6 into it, which we dealt with last week. You are sons of the Most High, all of you. And then he reads that as human rulers from the first verse. Hosea 1:10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. And of course, Paul quotes this in Romans as being fulfilled. And then the last one is Malachi 2:1, a son honors his father and a servant his master. If then I am a father, where is my honor? So he's calling Israel his son there. So that's the basic idea of that one. And then the seventh one is that they really feel like we're the ones who are importing a foreign theology that's not natural to the text. Talking about the supernatural, I came across a fella many years ago who hit one of his points was that there's nothing supernatural in the entire text up to Genesis 6 that you could even bring that in. Yeah, Derek, you got the look on your face that I had too, but that's still what he was saying. And then they kind of use the Nephilim thing. First of all, they'll say that it's a very clumsy translation to call it a giant, and the typical view has been that Nephilim comes from fallen ones. And then, so there isn't anything necessarily gigantic going on there. And then they'll say, and even though it's mentioned, it isn't even necessarily the case that you have to presuppose
creation,
that the Nephilim are the union of the marriages that are taking place there. That they were just sort of there on the earth, and they're just mentioned for whatever reason. And then they don't really usually go on to explain what that reason is. But so, those are several arguments that they're trying to give from the text itself for the Sethite view.
I think some commentary on Augustine is probably necessary here too. And kudos, Brian, for using the classical Latin pronunciation of Augustine. You got it right.
It's taken me years.
The great Augustine debate is usually medievalists pronounce Augustine, but it's a potato or potato sort of issue.
But we all know that it's
sorry,
potato.
the classicist. Yeah, right. The classicist had to weigh in. Augustine is such an interesting figure, not in terms of his relevance to this argument, but just in general church theology. Clearly, he believed in demonic fallen entities, or he would have not written something like The City of God, in which, ironically, we have one of the most complete records of classical mythology thanks to that very work, because he goes through and gives a biographical description of a lot of these Greco-Roman deities, and then proceeds to theologically lambast them, rightfully so. Doug and I have had a running conversation over the last couple of years about Augustine and his perspective on the Nephilim in particular, but by proxy, the sons of God, and why he was not necessarily invested in the supernatural interpretation of that, and we suspect that it stems largely from, not entirely, but substantially from his involvement in the Manichaean sect. The Manichaeans were a Gnostic sect, and one of the books that they utilized was a version of the apocryphal Book of Giants, which recounts a lot of this material in it. And it makes sense that this is all before, of course, Augustine's conversion. It makes sense that his hesitancy to accept the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6 stems, at least in part, from his experience with the Manichaeans and their interpretation of this interesting piece of apocryphal literature, the Book of Giants. And so I think that because Augustine has been such an influential figure theologically throughout the history of the church, it seems like that this has been part of the negative ramifications of that influence is pulling this rather narrow and naturalized or materialized version of interpreting Genesis 6. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's rather ironic because it was Augustine's attempt to Christianize the practice of veneration of ancestors, which grew out of the Canaanite and Amorite practice of the monthly kispum ritual, where the ancestors had to be summoned to a ritual meal through a necromancy rite so they could be fed. Christians continued this into the Christian era, and Augustine basically said, well, we can pray to the spirits of the saints, the holy ones who've gone on before us, and that's why Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox churches
to the history of
venerate
this,
saints to this day. I mean,
it
was
scholar named Yap
Augustine
has
who
kind of traced in
turned the church away from the supernatural understanding of Genesis 6 to avoid
the Sethite
any
view, actually. And he kind of
supernatural understanding there, and yet he actually turned the church toward the idea that we could pray to
when I read
spirits as long as they were, the holy saints who had gone on before.
Right around the same time. So it's Augustine and Chrysostom and Theodoret, and at least some of them are aware of the supernatural view, but it seems like when you read them that it's so far removed from what they're now into theologically that they talk about like the mad ravings of the Jews, and so they're thinking that somehow the supernatural view was some sort of a Jewish change to the text or something for whatever reason, which is completely ironic because it's actually the exact opposite. Because the Jews are the ones who actually changed the supernatural view because of Jesus, actually. But it doesn't seem like these church fathers were aware of that. And for whatever reason, Brian, you mentioned Julius Africanus, who was a historian who was traveling through Syria, which is where Yap kind of traces the origin of the Sethite view. It seems like what's happening, and he's writing 150 years before Augustine, and he's kind of saying that he's heard of these two different views. That's what he's saying. So somehow, what's happened is that the history of the view is changing, and he's aware of it. And you really have pretty much a long period of silence for a couple hundred years where guys aren't really talking about it a whole lot. And then by the time you get to these huge towering church fathers, it's like they're not really aware of any other view. And so they just sort of incorporate it and adopt it and say, well, of course, anybody else who would think anything different, it must be crazy.
Also, thus, supporting the notion that while appeal to early church fathers can be helpful and can be part of the argument, they disagree just as much as we did on everything, and it's not an ultimate proof of a viewpoint, because I and Doug, I know, we love Augustine, but he's not right about a lot of things, and so that's fine, that's okay, But it's also it's helpful to know the historical origins of some of these viewpoints, and I think that's part of the how we can begin to address before we get to the theological.
Because he did his dissertation on the Genesis 6 and what people believe. So he has 120 pages or something where he just goes through every single possible record that we know of, from the earliest Jews to the earliest Christians. Yeah. And in this case, the reason why he would write a paper on the provenance of the Sethite view is because he understands full well, and I do think that this is a pretty powerful argument. He knows full well that every single person among the Jews held to a supernatural view until time X. And then he knew that every single Christian held to that view until time Y, which is somewhere later than time X. So he's trying to go back and figure out, well, what happened? But what that means is that you have a universal not a mishmash of interpretations, a universal interpretation where there was only one interpretation of in both of these groups, which happened to be the supernatural view, which is something that I think that's something that really needs to be reckoned with from people that don't hold to our view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was because you pointed me to Jaap Doden's work that we cited him in our book Giants, Gods, and Dragons. It was the mid-second century AD, where Rabbi Simeon Bar Yochai cursed anyone who thought the B'nai Elohim were sons of God because he believed it meant sons of judges, getting us back to the Psalm 82, judges thing versus supernatural interpretation. And I think this is because after you had the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 130s AD, 132 to 135, and Christians were conscripted by Simon Bar Kokhba, and Christians were saying, well, Rabbi Akiva says you're the Messiah, but you're not standing in the clouds, you're not coming with great glory like our scriptures say, so we're not going to fight for you. And that caused really the final split between Christians and Jews in the community.
And the phrase is "Son of God."
Until the early
so if they're
century,
emphasizing
Jews
Jesus
and
is the
Christians
unique
got along. Christians were just sort of
Son
like
of
the
God,
odd cousins of
carrying with it the divinity that we talked about in the last
Judaism.
time.
But after that,
well, then it is definitely
they started
helpful to their
de-emphasizing
viewpoint
the
against
supernatural
Jesus
in
as Messiah,
Jewish
for them
thought,
to
because
then
Christians were
turn the word
saying,
"Son of
we know
God"
that,
into a human,
that second
into
power.
a human
We know who
phrase.
the angel of Yahweh is. We know who these other
Or
supernatural
human
beings are.
concept or whatever.
So before going to kind of giving a positive explanation of our view,
Right.
like what do you think, Brian? There's another view that's out there, which is kind of this dynastic king view. Guy that I love to read, Meredith Kline, is kind of one of the guys that put out a paper on that 50 or 60 years ago, which is interesting because as a Reformed guy, he actually sees some pretty serious holes in the Sethite argument. And he brings those up at the beginning, and then he says, well, here I want to give an alternative explanation that really, my opinion is that it kind of bears a lot of similarity to the early rabbinical view. But anyway, I don't know.
Can you express it, or?
Well,
because maybe we could answer them both at once,
Yeah, maybe we can. So he talks about how, first of all, kings are called sons of the god. In ancient Near Eastern literature, or sons of the gods. And that's very
or literally
well-known.
son of a specific god.
Or son of a specific god, exactly. So he's connecting that, first of all, to the kingship. And then he brings in the Psalm 82 thing, where they're human rulers. But then he goes back, Brian, to what you said earlier, and he talks about Cain and the origin of cities. And who is it that rules cities? Well, it's kings. And then you look at Lamech and you go, well, who is Lamech? Well, he must have been a king, he's a dynastic king. And so he's taking these clues from those two chapters and pulling out this idea of kings being these rulers. And he's saying that seems to be the best context. Now, in his view, it's a wholly naturalized view because he's looking at these later kings that certainly are humans, and none of us would dispute that. Nebuchadnezzar, there's none of us that would say Nebuchadnezzar was a god or even a demigod. He was a human, but he would be called the son of the gods, or son of whichever god. So that seems to be the idea. And then with the rabbinical view that Derek, you just brought up, these rabbis are somehow supernaturalizing it by saying that the sons of God here are these rulers that were there.
And the sin that they're engaging in is polygamy.
It's polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
So
They
it's
took
interesting
wives.
to me that you would have this alternate view to the Sethite theory that's a naturalized view, but it actually has similarities to the first really change from the supernatural view that came with the rabbis.
Yeah. And in one sense, they're both human interpretations. So hopefully, as we try to address some of these issues, that we'll see the overlap for sure.
Could you repeat that, Derek?
Yeah. Judd, how has discovery of some of the texts from other ancient cultures with languages similar to Hebrew, like Ugaritic and Eblaite and Mariot, how has that helped further our understanding of what that phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim means? Yeah, it's easy enough if we're looking at just the English translation, sons of God, and then comparing that to other uses of that phrase in English. Again, in the New Testament, there are Greek phrases that are translated as sons of God or sons and daughters of God. But getting a better sense of what the Hebrew means,
I think something that
how has the discovery of other
a lot is that there are
ancient
similar
Semitic
idioms
languages
and
helped give us a better
phraseology
context for
used,
understanding what that phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim means.
which
I mean,
we
in other words,
visited,
over the last 100 years,
in our last
the tablets
discussion,
found it Ugarit
that
and
there are these
Ebla
similar
and
kind of,
Mari and Akkadian texts and so on. How has that helped us to get a
literary
better sense of what
devices
the Hebrew
and
phrase means?
Eponyms and things like that are shared between between cultures like the ancient Hebrews and the Phoenicians and other West Asiatics. They had a similar way of structuring the way that they talked about their deities, and because all of those languages are related, it doesn't break any linguistic sin or linguistic law. You're not committing some sort of philological sin by comparing certain words and phrases between let's say Hebrew culture and the Phoenician culture. By doing that, we're able to, because we're talking about shared idioms and cognates and things like that. By doing that, we're able to tease out the supernaturalism. Not that in all cases it takes a lot of teasing out linguistically to do, but it clarifies in a lot of ways. Now that's the West Asiatic stuff. What's always interesting to me is walking these ideas back through the lens of the Septuagint. All of this ancient Near Eastern stuff that we're talking about came to us, and when I say us, I'm talking about the West, came to us through the classical lens, the Greek and Roman lens. Now we've in decades and in centuries past, we've learned a lot more about those cultures and languages in their own context. But the Septuagint, I think, is always a useful tool to do this in terms of clarifying the supernatural elements in it, because the rabbis that translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek were uniquely suited to do that, because they were Jews living in a Hellenized world, and so they understood both idioms that were at play. And so when you come across a passage like Genesis 6 and relating concepts like the sons of God, I think it's interesting to look at where that pops up in other passages in the Septuagint. In Genesis 6, it's actually spelled out as huioi tu theor, the sons of God. But when you look at analogous passages where this shows up, like in Job chapter 1, and I think it's Job chapter 37, the translators actually use the word angeloi. So clearly they understood that concept in terms of its divine counsel context. So the short answer is that we've learned quite a bit from the linguistics and philology that's been done in West Asiatic languages, comparing past passages in the Old Testament,
Jeb,
like those that show up in.
There's actually an Angeloi version of Genesis 6:2 in the Septuagint. So even that passage has at least one place where they did
right.
that.
Right. So. So it's not. Right.
Well, but
So
also, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we
I'm looking at,
went over
and
this
I'm looking at the
extensively in the
Septuagint
last
of
session
Job 2,
on
and verse
Psalm
1 of Job
82,
2 says, and it happened one particular day
phrase,
that the
son, like
angels
all the
of
Bible
God
verses
came to
that they'll
stand before
refer
the
to
Lord.
about using the word son.
So clearly the Jewish religious scholars in the
Yahweh
3rd century
refers to Israel
BC
as my
understood what was
firstborn
intended
son.
by the phrase
Deuteronomy
sons of God.
14:1. You are all sons of Yahweh, your God. Never is the technical phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim or B'nai Elohim, sons of God. Never is that used. In other words, yes, the metaphor of God's children being his sons as a generic metaphor, you should, yes, of course. But the argument is that the sons of God is a specific technical phrase that appears multiple times and in the same context of the divine council context that we already talked about. And so, I think we've already established that. So we've already established that the sons of God is the divine being thing. So when Meredith Klein and these guys just sort of dismiss it like, well, it can't be supernatural angels or something like that. It's sort of like, well, that's not, their other arguments are better than that argument. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
Well, to me, the problem is, and I don't know, this would be something to look into. Does the Septuagint use angeloi for human messengers?
It is curious
because we know that it is
the
used of
modern
human messengers
translators,
in
and really since
the New Testament, which means
Augustine have just
which is
kind
one
of
of the
glossed
problems
over
is
the
I think the
Septuagint translation. Just said, well,
intertestamental
those
period,
Jewish scholars
including
in
the
the 3rd century BC
Septuagint,
didn't know
kind
what they were
of got
didn't know what they were
sloppy,
doing.
and they sort of started using that word angel in a much more generic sense that can appeal to more things than just the sons of God. And that becomes part of the problem because when we're talking about gods verses, also sometimes gods was defined as angels. And people say, see, angels. But it's like, well, no, that's what the Greek says. But, you have to take into account the other, the original and the Hebrew and such as well. So it's kind of a difficult play there between, angelos and B'nai Ha-Elohim. But,
Well, we want to address this in a future episode, but you actually have the same problem even with Elohim, at least in the minds of a lot of people, where somehow this word Elohim is being used of humans. I forget which lexicon it is, but it gives as its first rendering for Elohim, human judges. So that's its first entry. And then, you think about the 3,000 uses of the word Elohim, and you start to read them and you're like, maybe it could be a use, but that's the first definition you've got. That's pretty stunning. So,
yeah.
But the point is that even that word, along with angel, can be a word that in the minds of a lot of people can overlap between heavenly beings or us.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing in John 10, right? Where they say that I said you are gods. And so they're saying, oh, well, Jesus is just calling the Pharisees he's talking to there as inheritors of the Sinai covenant. They're gods. So, but we'll deal with that in another episode.
Yeah, and in Hebrews it talks about the law was delivered through angels, but if you look back and read in Deuteronomy, it says no, the sons of God, the heavenly host, were with him, right? And not saying, I don't mean to say no, but I'm just saying that's where we can say, well, sometimes angelos does refer to the divine sons of God, but Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just Malachim, which is a lower, a lower station or whatever, and that's where the language changes can become problematic at times. But
my opinion, Brian, is that while yes, angel can be used of human messengers, the majority of times it's not.
Fair enough.
And that
but
seems
those who
pretty
oppose us will appeal to those
they will.
Exception passages, and that's why
They
we
will.
got it.
They will.
Mm-hmm. But when you take this in context and look at the fact that the neighboring Canaanites understood who the Rephaim were, and had in the Ugaritic text they actually had a monthly ritual that was performed for the Rephaim, the spirits of these mighty men who were of old, and other circumstantial evidence from other Amorite cities that appeared to depict in inscriptions sort of a middle tier of creation, with humans in the low level, the lowest level, and the high gods like Baal and Astarte, and on the upper level, and then in between appear to be these spirits that probably represent the Rephaim. So the neighboring Canaanites appear to have known who these entities were and where they came from. The Greeks certainly did, based on Hesiod, who said that the men who lived during the Golden Age when Kronos ruled in heaven, and the phrase that he used, according to Amar Anus, Merapes anthropoi, derives from the same Semitic root as Rephaim, Merapes, that when they died, their spirits became daemons, which leads to First Enoch and its explanation of the origin of demons, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood. The evidence connects together. It's not all biblical evidence. It's mostly, a lot of it is extra biblical. But again, when you're looking at what the neighbors of the ancient Israelites believed, and consider the possibility, as Mike Heiser used to say, that, hey, guess what? The apostles and prophets read books. They knew what their neighbors believed.
When I look at the dynastic king view,
I think the evidence weighs in favor of the supernatural understanding of who these sons of God, B'nai HaElohim, were, because that phrase was used in Canaanite to denote
but then my mind immediately goes
the
and
gods
says,
who were the children of their father god El and his consort Asherah.
In the ancient world that weren't just merely human. I think about a Plato who, in the Critias, talks about Poseidon. And listen, he actually says Poseidon took for his allotment the island of Atlantis and settled therein the children whom he had begotten of a mortal woman in a region of the island of the following description. And then, you learn that Poseidon is like, he gives birth to all these twins, and then these twins go and they rule over these cities. Well, at the very least, the twins are demigods. And so that's a supernatural view right there. And then the idea that Poseidon would be taking Atlantis, there's some kind of a rule and authority that he himself has as a full god, as somebody who's not a demigod. So when I read that dynastic king view, I just kind of say, okay, that adds to me a little bit more flavor for my view. And I don't see why that view has to be or necessitate only human rulers. I don't understand that. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, there's a precedent to a point in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is not a full god, but he's 2/3 god, and that's certainly an idea that's not. It's certainly not left out of world mythology. You're going to find more of that than you don't.
Well, without addressing the script. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. You're done. Go ahead, Judd.
No, I know. I basically finished my thought. Just that these god kings are not something that you're going to have a hard time finding in mythological traditions around the world.
Yeah. What I wanted
the dynast. I hear what Doug's saying about they're dynastic kings, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're human or fully human.
Yeah. What I wanted to add to that was, without addressing specific scriptural arguments yet, I do think that this is a more of a, I guess you'd call it a subjective cultural argument, but I do think that some of the animus behind the human view is a fear of the likeness to mythology. Precisely these things we talk about, that we see pagan parallels, right? And we conclude that while the Bible is definitely distinct, unique, and against paganism, it still shares a common cognitive environment, some common language, cognitive languages, etc. And therefore, it makes more sense that of a view that's more in line with that general view, such as the sons of God, sons of El, etc., but with its own distinct Yahwist interpretation. We have no problem with that, and that makes more sense because we're seeking the original ancient context. But this modern naturalistic sort of view, I think, and I've heard people say it, and I felt it myself, which is the very inner rejection of it was, that sounds like Greek mythology. That can't be Greek mythology. So I can't accept, I must reject anything that is similar to pagan mythology in my fear of it being too closely linked to paganism, right? Mm-hmm. And look, I know this is it's a speculation on my part, but I lived it. And I've seen it in many of the objections against our view. They'll at least bring out the fact that, they're getting this interpretation from pagan religions, and they're just, they're exegeting paganism rather than the Bible, and they're completely missing the point, because their desire to seek the exclusivity of Yahwism makes them reject the other side of the truth, which is, but there is also similarity. So this is the Christian sort of self-imposed ignorance of, I'm only going to look at the differences to keep my religion separate from paganism, rather than looking at the differences and the similarities in order to understand a true combined, I don't know what you'd call it, but the more biblical view is understanding it within that context. At least, did we lose Derek?
Yeah, I think that he's gone.
I guess it's you and me, Doug. We're still recording.
Judd's there, but he got rid of his picture.
I'm here.
Oh, we can't see you, but we can hear you.
I'm here.
Brian, you brought up the mythology thing. And,
it's the fear of mythology.
Yeah, that's right. And it reminded me of a quote that I found when I was doing the original research from Francis Schaeffer, of all people. So Francis Schaeffer is a Reformed apologist, very well respected.
No, I'm here.
And like this is not the same as quoting Tolkien or Lewis on myth. This is Francis Schaeffer, very different sort of a thing.
Yeah.
And we love to talk about Tolkien and Lewis and how they understood what myth was and why they employed it and stuff, and we have talked about that on this show. But Schaeffer actually has this quote. He says, more and more we're finding that mythology in general, though greatly contorted, very often has some historic base. And the interesting thing is that one myth that one finds over and over again in many parts of the world is that somewhere a long time ago, supernatural beings had sexual intercourse with women and produced a special breed of people.
Dude, send me that quote. I got to have that. I forgot.
He actually is talking about our text that we're looking at tonight in relation to mythology. And when I first read that, that really confirmed, I think, for me that, okay, it is okay to think about the idea of myth in a way that is historical. And I don't have to just throw it out and say that, it's pure fantasy, it's total fiction, it's utter make-believe. The myth is something different than that. And it causes me to think of the arguments that guys give about a worldwide flood. Because people that support that whole idea of a flood, it's funny because some of these same people will look at Genesis 6 and go, it's all mythology. But then they'll quote what 400 people groups from around the world believe in a worldwide flood. Well, what are they telling those stories in?
That's a great point.
They're telling them in myth. I mean, that's the whole point. So how can you sit there and say that you're going to use all these myths of the flood and that is an argument to show that the Bible is telling a true thing, and then turn around with another myth that has almost as many people talking about it and say, no, we're not allowed to do that because that's mythology.
Which is basically selective theology based on personal bias. That's all it is.
Right. If you guys, I suppose I should say, pay all attention to the man behind the curtain since you can't see me. But yeah, that word, as I've commented any number of times, that word has been so maligned in Western languages that we inherit the cultural dross of the extreme empiricism of the Enlightenment, in particular, and we instantly see words like myth, and particularly as believers, we're sort of geared towards thinking that, well, that immediate, as Brian pointed out, that immediately equates to paganism. There's nothing that could inform a biblical worldview there, because there's nothing. We serve God, we don't serve demons. The pagans serve demons. Well, just breaking down the word etymologically, our projection of fable and something as a fallacy or a lie or something like that, something that's just completely made up. That's so after the fact, because the word mythos means a story, and you can take any number of myths and analyze them through every methodology that's available to mythologists and anthropologists and linguists, and you can see that there are elements of history in it. Just in Western tradition, you can do that. So if we can get people to look at myth in more people to look at myth in these terms, to see that it's not that it's not a bad word. Myth is a 4-letter word, but it's not a bad word. It's something
love
that can
is
actually
a
be
4-letter word too.
That's a good one.
Love is a 4-letter word. That's right. We're really digging into the Lewis now. We're going to talk about the one true myth and the loves.
I think this is some good things to think about, to bring nuance and to expand people's worldview thinking, which is really, in some ways, this may be the most important stuff we're talking about. However, we are talking to a Christian crowd, and Christians, prove it to me from the Bible. Show me from the scriptures. So let's take a look at some of those scriptures. I know I have to say that sometimes when I if I want to refresh my memory on things like the Sethite view and stuff, I don't just go to my own book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth, which has some good material on there, but I actually rely more on Doug's book, Giants, Sons of God. So I highly recommend that everyone definitely get his book on that, because I think he does a really good extrapolated description and explanation of the Sethite view. But I want to take a look at some of these things that I did actually bring up of the other view. In fact, let's go back earlier to that verse in Genesis 4:26.
Yeah.
This is where it says, this is about the 2 lions, right? And it says, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And again, to remind you, they were saying that, see, this is an expression of the new line of Seth, because it's right after it says Seth was born. So this is a description of how the line of Seth began to call upon the name of Yahweh, as opposed to the line of Cain that did not. So, Doug, have at it.
Well, one of the things that they never bring up with the Sethite view is the Targum interpretation of this verse. I'll just read 2 of them. We have at least 3 Targums, Aramaic paraphrases that were, the point of a Targum is really to take the text that was written in Hebrew and then help those Aramaic speakers who were living 1,000 years after it was written to help them understand what's going on. And so they're making interpretive decisions. So that doesn't mean their decision is correct, but it does show you that what they were thinking at the time. And because we have at least two of these that say this, something along the same lines, I think we need to at least wrestle with it. So the Onkelos Targum says, in his days, the sons of man were lax from praying in the name of the Lord. Well, that's interesting. The Targum Neophiti says, the sons of man began to make idols for themselves and to surname them by the name of the Memra of the Lord. And so, I think that Targum Jonathan probably says polluted. They began to pollute the name of the Lord. In other words, it's kind of, they're reading it actually the exact opposite as calling upon the name of the Lord, as in, look at these holy Sethites and how good they are because they're worshiping God. They're saying, no, something began to go awry in those early days where they actually started to pervert the worship of God, which is, if that's at least even a possible interpretation, let alone one that's pervading the Targums in the days of the New Testament, that's something that you need to take seriously.
And it's not just the Targums as an interpretive, or let me put it this way, there is lexical basis for that, because you look up the word for the Hebrew for the word began in our English, and you see that it actually is huhal, which means to be defiled or to be profaned, which is kind of odd because you're like, now again, the translators are engaging in interpretation because they're not exactly sure how to interpret that verse, so they chose this one way, but the word people is not in the text. It is contextually, but it's not literally. So it's more about, you could read it as there's a pollution began upon the name of Yahweh, So it's not just that the Targumim, because there's a lot of goofy stuff coming out of the Targumim, right? Mm-hmm. But I would agree with you that it still is a helpful way of understanding how did ancient Jews possibly see it, just to make sure that we have all possibilities. But then the lexical reference, backs that. But I would also say that, there's this this assumption that it's all the Sethites began to call upon the name of Yahweh, and there is no indication in that text that it's either line of Seth or Cain. There's no reference to Seth or Cain. It comes after the verse that Seth was replaced Abel, but there's no indication in the text that this phrase is being talked about exclusively of the Seth line. In fact, it is, as I understand it, grammatically, it is more generic. That's why the English interpretation says people began to call upon the name of the Lord, because Seth is not in the text. Is my point.
This idea that all of the sons of Seth were godly and all of the sons of Cain were wicked. I mean, if you start to just kind of play that out, I've thought about this. You're dealing here with at least 7 generations. Go back in your own family line for 7 generations. How many people are going to be born from your great grandparents, right? A lot.
Interestingly,
now,
the Septuagint.
These people are living to be hundreds and hundreds of years old and having an awful lot of kids. So I'm supposed to believe that every single Sethite that was ever born was godly. And furthermore, every single Cainite that was ever born was ungodly. Mm-hmm. And into that, I'm supposed to now believe that these sons of God, these godly, amazing people who have never sinned ever,
who call upon the name of the Lord.
Called upon the name of the Lord. Now, all of a sudden, they are committing this sin that is so vile, marrying a non-Christian, that God has to wipe the earth out for it. Like, how does this happen that all of a sudden every Sethite that has ever lived all of a sudden sees all these Canaanite women who are evil, and together at the same time they start marrying them? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And to compound that, the Bible says that there were other children of Adam and Eve. Why are they disregarded? As if they don't exist. That would be literally just saying these 2 lines are all that matter and all the other humans do not matter to God? No, that can't possibly be. So these specific beings that are talked about here, whatever the phraseology, yeah, it definitely has to be more than the sons of Seth, or it's just it's almost nonsense.
Yeah, I think in the life of Adam and Eve, the pseudepigrapha, that's the whole storyline of the fall and how it is that they ended up getting kicked out of Eden. But in that story, they mentioned something like 60 sons of Adam, as tradition. So, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're not living for that long as the very first human on Earth, and you're only having three kids, and one of them died from murder, and then that's it. So
yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point you're bringing up, Brian, that if you think about the percentages of it, that we're only dealing here with 1/30% of all of Adam's children.
Yeah. What else about that first 6:1? When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. So,
should we just kind of go through it and kind of look at it? So this is a point that Klein actually brings out in his dynastic view, that he thinks this is pretty damaging. When man, so that's the word Adam, began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. So in verse 1, it's actually defining the daughters as the daughters of man, of the daughters of Adam. Yeah. And that Adam is very deliberately chosen word there, right? Because that takes us back to the first person in the genealogies, both genealogies.
But it's fair to note that Adam, depending on context, can mean generally man or Adam specifically.
It could, but either way, you're dealing with something that's broader than Cain. Yeah. Okay, and that's how the first verse sets it up. But then suddenly, if you take the Sethite view, you actually have to change the definition of man in the second verse without any real grammatical justification for doing so. Yeah. So in verse 1, it has to have, it's this bigger group, right? You got your big circle, and then in verse 2 on the Sethite view, you have the sons of God, so that's Sethites, and the daughters of man, that's Cainites. So now all of a sudden, we've got two groups within that bigger circle, and yet we have the same word that's being used, the daughters of man. And on what grounds do you do that, especially when that word man there is Adam? It's not Cain, it's not Seth. So I think that's that's just looking
equivocation.
It's an equivocation, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you torture the words enough, they'll admit to anything. Yeah.
Also, though, something that stands out to me is that there, nowhere in the whole Bible is there any phrase the sons of Cain, or what I mean? Like, there's no reference like that anywhere, or daughters of Cain, or anything like that. So in other words, this would be an entirely novel situation, and I think that makes it quite weak.
I think verse 3, so this is one that Murray brings up, that my spirit will not abide in man forever. So what they'll point out is they'll say, look, the focus of this here is on humans. And that's true. And then they'll kind of say, and so that's the whole point of this. If verse 3 is really zeroing in on the humans, then why are we talking about supernatural entities on either side of that? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so then God destroys humans from the face of the earth. And one of the things that I think is fair to bring up in response to that is that a little bit later on, it talks about how all flesh had corrupted its way. All flesh. And that flesh there has to be referring to anything that has flesh. So whether it be animals, humans, or angels, and especially if we're right that angels are the sons of God, then that would be included in the all flesh. And that ends up becoming actually the primary reason why God is destroying the earth, because all verse 3 says is that he's not going to abide in man forever, so he's going to limit our time here to do this to 120 years, and then he's going to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, verse 3 is one that I don't usually focus on a whole lot, but I think that it's actually kind of important for our view.
Yeah.
All right, just checking. Am I back in the room? Have I?
You are
Yes,
back
you
in the
are.
room.
Okay.
You are.
I left and re-entered. I was hearing and following along everything you guys were saying, even though you guys couldn't
that's
see or
good.
hear me. So very, very strange. That's never happened before. But I'm glad you guys were carrying the conversation, just carried on like nothing was going on. No one will ever know, except that I'm just now telling everybody what just happened. So. But just as well, because I didn't have anything to contribute that was on the level of what you guys were discussing. So, as Brian, as you said in a previous program, if I wasn't part of this, I would watch this show. So,
Should we look at verse 4?
No, I think we should end on verse 4 because then we can have the next show being
There you
focusing
go.
in on Nephilim. Because I think there's still more to talk about here, you know?
I think so too. There's a lot of overlap when you do the Venn diagram here.
Yeah.
But I think starting with that and then seeing how that fits into, I think the Rephaim references that are sort of hidden and obscured in the other parts of Scripture, and the spiritual wickedness that derives from that, and that gets back to some of the references, the use of the term Elohim or its contracted form Elim. By Isaiah. There's some really interesting wordplay that I'll bring in the next one that
Something I want to
think
address
relates to this.
For the sorry to interrupt, the divine king's view here. It's an interesting thing. So this notion that in the ancient Near East, the kings were referred to as sons of a god or sons of the gods, etc. Interestingly, actually, there are no references to the kings as a group in any way, like as if they are sons of God. You know what I mean? Like they are individual kings claim to be a son of Horus or whatever, a son of the god, etc. But there's never any reference in those ancient world of these kings having some kind of group concept, as in what's being talked about here, which is sons of God, a particular group of people. So in order to interpret it that way, you'd have to see this as a sort of I don't know, maybe an arbitrary grouping that in fact, in other words, if you're going to draw your interpretation of sons of God, this is from the ancient Near East, but then reject the fact that, but in the ancient Near East, there is no concept of a group of sons of God, then you've got a contradiction there that you have to deal with.
I'd like to hear Judd talk a little bit about the divine right of kings, but let me kind of give it a preface because it seems to me that you have a parallel going on later on in the Old Testament when God is rejected as the king of Israel, and so then the people said they want a king like all the other kings, and so he gives them Saul, who's a head taller than everyone else, which is interesting because that kind of harkens to the giant nature of whoever these guys are. But then you have eventually David being the one who becomes the son of God, his special chosen king or whatever. And what you have there is you have the God, in our case, God himself, who is giving the kingship to the human. That's what I want to hear Judd talk about. But if we look at it from the angel of the Lord point of view, it's actually the angel of the Lord who is the king of Israel, who they have rejected. But the angel of the Lord is a supernatural being. He's not a human person. And so if that's taken into consideration here, then you have more evidence straight from the biblical worldview and what's going on with the whole shifting of God being the king of Israel to now the son of man, David being the king of Israel. Eventually, in my opinion, is because we need to have the Messiah both be divine and human. And that's why one of the reasons why this happens. But Judd, what do you have to say about the divine right of kings and how it might help us understand this?
Well, what you lay out in terms of the divine right of kings through Yahweh, that's how it was always going all the way through Jesus, as the Messiah. That's how the divine right of kings is supposed to play out. But we actually have more examples of how that's been corrupted I think, and if there's anything to my thesis in a paper that I wrote a few years back on the words for kings and their phonetics, not just phonetic but idiomatic and cognate similarity with words like Rabbah and Repha and so on and so forth, that hearken not only to kingship but the divine ancestor kings of ancient Near Eastern mythology. I think what we're looking at is a large scale corruption of the good, and it's worked its way into basically every monarchy in the world. If you look at the earliest kinds of monarchies, they're all theocratic monarchies. You know, particularly the farther back you go, they believe that their kings were gods on the earth, probably literally some sort of semi-divine being in the early stages. But even in instances of fully human kings, this idea of investiture by the divine, investiture by God, is recurrent throughout the world. You know, when you consider that, you know, even in our own day, although most monarchies are constitutional monarchies of one sort or another, even as recent as the 18th century, when you consider when the American Revolution took place, there was a Tsarina in Russia. There was a sultan that ruled over the Ottoman Empire. Both the kings of China and Japan at the time believed that they were divinely appointed and divine themselves. The kings of Europe believed that they were all put into their places by divine right, and so there's the pure, and this is right out of the demonic playbook. This is right out of their playbook, is to corrupt, you know, the pure kingship, the pure divine investiture that God gives through the line of the Messiah, and then to make this corrupt counterfeit version of it throughout all of the monarchies that have or most of the monarchies that have existed in human history.
And therein lies the parallel between God sending B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God, to earth after the Tower of Babel incident, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, and God giving the Israelites Saul. You want to be all like all the other nations? Okay, but you're not going to like it. Well,
Yeah.
It's more than just God picks some or the gods pick some human. It's that they actually see themselves as somehow descended from them. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. To one degree or another, yes. In the ancient world, this is certainly more prevalent than, let's say, in modern history or early modern history. But in the ancient world, that idea was very prolific.
Yeah. So you can
And I'm not
deny
just
that
talking about
it was true.
Say again.
Yeah, I said you can. So somebody could deny that it's true. I mean, that's something you could do, but you can't deny that that's what they thought.
You could certainly deny it on the basis of whether it was true or not. What you cannot deny are the cultural artifacts that we have from that world that inform us and tell us that in fact that is what they believed. And that seems to be one of the problems that we're hovering around here is presentism, is the tendency of the modern academic community to project values onto the past, or interpretations onto the past, and not just the academic community. We're talking about biblical circles, Christian circles here too. The tendency is to project, our culture onto the past, and by doing so, we peripheralize the original context of these passages. We take out all of the cultural context that's in place. So yeah, you could argue that a person could argue that it's not true, but what you cannot do is say that people didn't believe that in the ancient world, because they certainly did. And it's it's not just something that's touched upon in the Bible. It's from records that we have from ancient Mesopotamia, from ancient Anatolia, from ancient Egypt. They write it out explicitly, how they felt about their kings on the earth.
And interestingly, that seems to be the perception of Bible scholars going back even a century or more. That while they may deny that it's true, the consensus among Bible scholars is that what was written in Genesis 6:4 is what the Hebrew prophets meant, that supernatural beings came down and commingled with human women. That's just not what's taught at seminary, and that's why it's not the consensus view amongst Christians sitting in the pews today.
I also think, though, that a powerful argument for understanding, what are these sons of God? Are they angels? Are they humans? And we've talked about this before, but since we're talking about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, is 2 Peter and Jude, where
right.
So you've got the New Testament, you've got the apostles, you've got Peter writing in 2 Peter 2:4, for God, if God did not spare angels, and that's the supernatural, when they sinned, but cast them into Gehenna, or not Gehenna,
Tartarus, yeah.
Tartarus, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness for judgment, etc. And he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, etc., etc. So we see the context in 2 Peter is the time of Noah, angels sinning. Well, there's literally nothing else in the book of Genesis about that time period that could possibly refer to angels sinning, except that one passage. And the sin in that passage, like you already mentioned, Doug, it leads to the judgment of the flood, which is what Peter is saying. And so Peter himself and Jude, which reinforces the same notion here, is Jude of course says they left their heavenly habitation, and they sought after strange flesh. So that's the angels seeking after human flesh. That also fits with this paradigm, which is angels coming down from heaven. They're violating. So our view of understanding, like you're mentioning, Doug, I think it actually incorporates the best of some of those other views within the supernatural view, in that there is a holiness code going on here. There is a notion of a violation of a separation, and the separation is the heavenly and the earthly, and that is what's going on, in that the angels are coming out of their heavenly habitation, violating that, and uniting with the daughters of men, something they were not supposed to do, and that's why they were judged.
I think that the Jude thing is worth talking a little bit more. I'll just focus on Jude, because we should keep reading. So first of all, what people need to know is that what Jude is doing here was very common in intertestamental literature. He's giving moral examples, and there's a finite list of them. There's only like 10 of them, even less sometimes. And he's giving examples of how we are not to behave, okay? And so he's not going against that tradition. He's actually using that tradition. And we have, I put that in the book. But this is what it says. So angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he's kept in eternal chains until gloomy darkness, until the judgment of the great day. That's what you just said, Peter, is just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Well, what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah? How many times did I hear growing up that this is just purely about same-sex male relations or whatever? But the story is very clear that you have two men that were sitting there talking with Abraham. These two men are in the story called angels. They miraculously just somehow appear in Sodom and Gomorrah in an instant. And then what do the men want to do? They want to do the very same thing that's going on in Genesis 6, and Jude is making that direct connection.
Well, a kind of twisted version of it.
Thing. It's a twisted version, but what I'm saying is that you have the angels in both cases, and Jude seems to be. I keep looking at Jude, but I'm thinking about Jude, and so I keep saying Jude.
Judd.
But
Potato, potato, potato.
It's actually Judas. The name is technically, but they didn't want to name the book of the Bible that way. So
I'm not
they
going to
shortened
call
it
him
to
Judas, but I don't know, man. The point is that he's making those direct links together, and verse 7 actually helps us interpret better verse 6 in Jude.
Right.
And,
Likewise, indulged in sexual immorality. But Peter also makes the same connection if you skip down to verse 9 and 10, because, again, verse 4, he says, "For God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, be kept until the judgment." Verse 9, "Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority." So again, the lust of defiling passion, this
And
crossing
authority.
of the species
The authority part of that is really big too,
Well,
because
yes.
especially if you read the Enoch stuff, what authority are they violating? They're violating God's authority. They're like,
Right.
we're going to go and do this thing, and they swear that oath. And
Right.
come
Well,
down,
many Christians will say, well, pursuing unnatural desire or strange flesh, as other translations say, which I think is a better translation, but unnatural desire, well, yeah, that's the homosexuality. They
sure.
say that,
and
right?
none of us would disagree with that.
In principle,
Right,
but
right.
the lexically, the Greek is actually heteros sarx, so it's actually flesh. It's pursuing
Flesh.
strange flesh, and if it was homosexuality, it would not be hetero sarx. It would be a different phrase.
I want to bring up one point that Murray made, where he's talking about marriage and what's at stake here. And this is something that kind of the commentator that I was reading on the blog, it kind of puts us into a modern spin, because Murray's writing this, 70 years ago. Marriage, because of what it is, can only be a union of a human male and a human female. I think that's interesting and that's his take. And I don't know that Murray would have said that 50 years ago. He never would have had to worry about that. That's definitely a post letting gay couples get married or whatever, right? That he's commenting on there. But think about what we're saying that angels are, what the Bible's saying that they are. It's using a term, the term is ish in Hebrew, that is used for humans. We translate it as men, and it's using the very same term for angels, and we translate that as men. In other words, somehow with angels, we share this word ish that we translate as men. What we do not share with them is the word Adam. They are never, ever called Adam. Only humans are. So it's like it's your species genus sort of a thing, that we both share the higher, but we don't have the lower. We're separated. But if you think about the idea of men, and the claim is made all the time, well, angels they don't have biological the equipment to do anything, and that's kind of the classic. Jesus says that angels don't marry and give in marriage. That one usually comes up there, but they are called men. And if they're called men, you're not supposed to have an angel man marrying a human woman, but it doesn't mean it can't happen if they're sinning, right? Any more than you can't have two lesbians marry each other because they're sinning.
Yeah,
Now you can debate whether it's actually marriage or not, but the word marry, and I get that there's a technical phrase there that, yes, this always refers to marriage, but there's not the word marriage isn't there. And the idea of taking, that seems to me, I don't know if you guys might disagree with this, but that seems to have repercussions that aren't necessarily mutual with the women. Like, okay, you're taking me maybe against my will. I don't know.
There are some passages where that word is used. For example, not all, but rape, like in Genesis 34:2. That's the word that's used of
Dinah.
Yeah. They seized her and lay with her. So it is used in context, but not always. So sometimes you can find
debatable.
But it is one of the possible understandings of it. Absolutely.
And that proof text to claim that angels don't marry or give in marriage, Jesus specifically says, "You will be like the angels in heaven who neither marry nor give in marriage. The angels in Genesis 6, or the sons of God, were not in heaven.
Yeah, they left their proper domain.
Which, right, Jude said they left their, that's part, that's the whole point. They left that proper domain. Yeah. And also reinforcing, what you were saying, Doug, about angels and men, there's an equivocation biblically. But I think that also reflects the aspect of why we say angels. This gets back to the strange flesh. Wait a minute, angels don't have flesh? Well, yeah, they do. They have heavenly flesh. It's a different kind of flesh. That's the point. That angels are not disembodied spirits floating around like people envision them. They are literally, they have heavenly flesh. Now, this flesh is different from ours. It's similar to ours. They can be men, but it's different in that obviously they can, I call it interdimensional. They are beings that can go interdimensionally in a way that our flesh cannot. But nonetheless, they're described as eating in the book of Genesis, right? The angels come and they eat with Abraham. And our argument would be in this passage, they are described as having sex with women.
Yeah, they have feet that can be washed.
Yes.
Jacob wrestles with one of them.
Yep. And so... and they kill people. They kill people with swords that are real and are material in the sense of they can actually kill people with those swords, etc. So it's important to understand because so often when Christians are talking about these things, they think of angels as these disembodied spirits, and they're not.
The early church understood the connection. The second apology from Justin Martyr, his letter to the Roman Senate arguing to defense of the faith, made it clear that he understood that the angels who had transgressed their appointment to oversee humanity were the ones that the Greeks and the Romans called gods. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's only, like we said earlier, he's only, Justin's writing in the 2nd century.
161 AD,
and
roughly.
He's only reiterating what everybody believed, according to all of the extant material.
Right.
It's theoretically possible we could find something that disagrees with it, but we haven't found it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So, Doug, are there any more of those 7 points that you originally brought up that we should probably...
I think we've probably touched on all of them.
Touched on more? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reiterate again the point just with the sons of God idea that from last time, because there are a lot of places where Israel is somehow called a son. And one of the reasons that I think that this worldview is so helpful, our worldview, is because it actually explains why Israel becomes a son in a way that I can't comprehend apart from this worldview. That somehow there are these heavenly beings called sons of God that are given divine rule over us as his heavenly children, created as they are. And because of their evil, God decided in eternity past, really, because that's the whole point of sending Christ to be the God-man, is to gain the glory for himself in doing that, that he wanted to extend that originally in the Garden of Eden to a human being who is called the Son of God in Luke's genealogy of Jesus. And that because these guys got their inheritance early and then they squandered it like the prodigal son, God is disinheriting them and giving that inheritance to human beings who are in Christ. And the whole point of that one in Hosea, they will be called sons of the living God. This only really makes full sense in light of our worldview, not despite of our worldview, that's a prophecy that's going to be true sometime in the future, that Christians will be called sons of the living God in a way that's analogous to what happened with the heavenly beings, because we are now replacing them. This is the way Mike talked about it, on the divine council.
Yeah.
And that's really the whole idea of the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel. That's how that's working its way out. I know that it's a Greek thing, but there's 12 Olympians for a reason. And those are the guys who are ruling on that council. And we are disinheriting them. And, as Mike brought this one up a lot, don't you know that we will judge angels? Well, what's the point of that? That's a Sons of God text that really only makes full sense and good sense in light of what we're talking about. If you don't have this worldview, you can't make sense of it. So, of course, yeah, we don't deny that Israel is called God's son. We don't deny that Christians are called God's son. But that's not the point. The point is that theology comes from somewhere prior to it, which is that heavenly beings were called God's son.
Right.
And somehow there's a relationship going on between us and them.
Amen.
That's why there's so much inheritance language in the New Testament, sonship language. And yeah, it's all part of theology. Yeah, we are going to be brought back and reintroduced to the divine council someday. That, amazing
Powerful.
picture. Yeah.
That's shocking to some Christians because it's like they haven't seen that connection. And when you make it,
right.
At first it's sort of like, that sounds weird. Are you saying we're going to become like gods, or we're going to become angels or something like that? And it's like, no, you have to understand the fullness of that theology. And we are called sons of God now. And this is the now and the not yet component, right? We are sons of God, but it's not yet what we will fully be.
We are Ish with them, but we are Adam, and they are not. And we will always retain Adam in our nature. We will be glorified Adamites in a way that will allow us to do something even better and greater than what the heavenly beings did, because Christ is the one who has, gone ahead of us and done that work for us, and then also on the heavenly sons of God side of it too.
Now, the one thing that we did hold off was another one of the arguments for, or shall we say, against the human view and for the supernatural view, is the result of that union of the sons of God and the daughters of men, which is the Nephilim in verse 4.
Right.
The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore them children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, the human interpretation says that the Nephilim just means fallen ones, and that's the consequences of the bad intermarriages, and they are the mighty men. That's the word Gibberim, which means mighty warriors. So the divine king's view says those mighty men, those divine warriors, that was a way of saying that progeny became tyrants because they considered themselves gods, and those were the tyrants of old, the men of renown. That's how the kingship view says. And the Sethite view, I don't know how but in general, just the human view tends to say, well, the Nephilim they tend to avoid, the Nephilim means giants, or they have no answer for it.
Right.
But let's not go any farther, because that's for the next show.
Right. We will unpack that in next month's Iron and Myth as we bring back for next month's discussion, which will be episode number 31. Brian Godawa, you'll find all of his work online at godawa.com. Pastor Doug Van Dorn, douglasvandorn.com, and Judd Burton, Dr. Judd Burton, burtonbeyond.net. Fascinating stuff. Sorry I dropped out for a while there, fellows, but that's one of those technical issues that comes with getting internet out in the country. But fascinating stuff. Thanks for carrying it, and we'll talk to you again next month. Check the notes below this video or audio if you're listening, wherever that may be, and you'll find links to the websites of Pastor Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and Dr. Judd Burton, and they'll be back again next month for another edition of Iron and Myth here on A View from the Bunker. Coming up, we'll tell you about the upcoming places we're going to be, and the irony here is delicious. They recognized the state of Palestine, they just don't want to live there. I'll tell you who next. Bless their pointy little heads as A View from the Bunker continues.
They thought Queen Jezebel would bring diversity and progress to ancient Israel. She brought Baal, the storm god of Canaan. Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history. The War of Gods and Men. A must-read, Jezebel, Harlot Queen of Israel, in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Giants, gods, dragons, they're all real. We may not see them with our natural eyes, but their handiwork is evident in what's happening in the world around us, the spiritual warfare taking place.
It is so true. It's obvious in Israel, but worldwide. Historically, we've seen this happen. And we want you to get excited about the Old Testament and the New and the giants, gods, and dragons within it, because your kids need this information. So do you.
Yes. We're living in prophetic times. Help make sense of it with our special offer through July. Our book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, which takes a fresh look at end times prophecy. My book's Bad Moon Rising, about the spiritual forces behind Islam. And Last Clash of the Titans, the overlap between what we were told is Greek mythology and the Bible. And our DVD, based on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. All of this, an $80 value for just $45 plus shipping and handling, now through July, only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. Driving the internet to think every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. That is our web hub. You'll find our global hub for everything Sharon and I do, gilberthouse.org, my personal site, derekpgilbert.com. You'll also find us on the social media, X at View from Bunker, at Derek Gilbert, and at GilbertHouse_TV. That is our new account there. You'll also find us on Facebook, the View from the Bunker page there. Give us a like, follow us there. Truth Social, Gab Me We Get Her at Derek P. Gilbert. Also on Threads, if you care, at Derek Gilbert. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. That is at Gilbert House. At Gilbert House. Subscribe, click the bell for notifications, share that with your friends, and then guarantee we never get canceled by downloading our free app. That brings all of our content right into your smartphone or tablet. That way, if they decide to go back and find something I talked about 10 years ago that they find offensive, it's happened, and they decide to pull down our channel, well, then you'll still be protected because we're putting our archives on our app as fast as we can. We've been asked to move stuff over to Rumble, tried doing it. Rumble wasn't ingesting it fast enough. We'll continue that project. I am the IT department. Sharon and me work a small operation, so we're working as fast as we can to get that done. But meanwhile, please take step one, download the app, gilberthouse.org/app, gilberthouse.org/app. You'll also find a link at vftb.net. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, you probably heard the news that 3 European nations, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, had announced that they were recognizing an independent state of Palestine. Now, this is not a new thing. There are 146 nations around the world that recognize an independent Palestine, but new for Western European nations, especially nations with a, say, Christian background, if not a current worldview, but at least a background that is based in the Bible. So this is kind of a new thing. But the Spanish have found out that this is not going to be as easy to accomplish as that they would like. Now, I find the irony, first of all, that the Spaniards would recognize an independent Palestine to be amusing. I won't laugh because a lot of blood has been shed over the centuries here. But when you go back and look at the 1,400-year history of Islam, first of all, the idea that the Jewish residents of Israel today are colonists or colonizers is rather hilarious, because the Arabs themselves colonized Palestine after the Muslim conquest beginning around 638 AD, when they won the Battle of Yarmouk against the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Yarmouk, that's the river that enters the Jordan just south of the Sea of Galilee from the east, border between Syria and Jordan. Anyway, not long after that, the armies of Islam, mostly Arab at that point, exploded outward into Anatolia, Turkey, eastward into Mesopotamia, took over what was Syria, Iraq, most of Iran today, defeated what was left of the Sassanid Persian Empire, conquered all of North Africa to the west, then crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and conquered, yes, Spain. In fact, Spain, for the better part of 700 years, was under all or mostly Islamic control. In fact, France would have fallen to the Muslims too if it had not been for Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in the year 732 AD. Look at where Tours is on a map. You'll see it's about halfway between Paris and the English Channel. So First of all, the accusations of colonizers directed at Israelis is hypocritical and devoid of historical foundation. But for the Spaniards, who, if they had any sense of their own national history, would understand what it meant to be ruled by Muslims for 700 years, the last of them not expelled until 1492. So a lot of us know that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella kicked the Jews out in 1492. They weren't going after the Jews. They were kicking out the Muslims. It's just the Jews they considered to be Muslim adjacent or something. And so because they refused to convert to Christianity, unlike the Muslims who would convert overtly and then wait for a convenient time to rise up and start killing their neighbors. That's a thing with Islam. You're allowed to lie in the service of Allah. Anyway, so the irony there of Spain acknowledging an independent Palestine when it took 700 years for the Spaniards to drive the Muslims back out, Arab Muslims for the most part, at least until the Berbers came over later. But anyway, it is kind of amusing. More amusing was a story that hit the Jewish News Service on June 5th, that the Spanish government's plan to open an embassy in Ramallah, which is where you would put your embassy to recognize an independent Palestine, because, you know, it's not going to be in East Jerusalem as much as the Arabs want it. Israel's not going to let that happen. So Ramallah, being the headquarters of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, that's where you'd put the Spanish embassy. The problem is that Spanish diplomats don't want to live there. They refuse to move from Israel. Currently, they've got the diplomats in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. They refuse to move to Ramallah because of safety and quality of life concerns. In other words, it's too dangerous, and we can't get the same stuff in Ramallah that we get in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. We can't move around freely. The internet's better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Spain, acknowledging a Palestinian state, it just doesn't want to put its diplomats there because they don't want to live there. Well, we wish all the best to the governments of Spain, Ireland, Norway in trying to find diplomats willing to move to Ramallah to make the independent Palestine a reality. And in the meanwhile, we just say, bless your pointy little heads. We were just at the Mysteries of the Bible Verse live event in Cincinnati. That was last weekend. Wonderful time, excellent content. And the good news is DVD sets of the presentations will be available. And I think we can vouch for the quality because the gentleman doing the recording for it, Film Revolutions, Matt Piskarich, does a lot of the video editing and captioning work for Skywatch TV. So we know that he knows what he's doing. So all of the presentations from yours truly, Rudy Landa, Pastor Mike Hoggard, who you will see on this program next week, by the way, discussing his presentations at that conference. Greg Patton, wonderful, wonderful discussion. Micah Van Huss, great presentation on secret societies. All of that will be available on DVD soon from Southwest Radio Ministries, their website, swrc.com. And we'll keep you posted on when those are available. Now, next weekend, we will be at the Finley River Ranch in Sparta, Missouri. Sparta is about halfway between Springfield and Branson. This is our annual, it's becoming an annual thing, as we go to just preach and teach at His Call Ministries. June 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, Friday evening, Saturday morning and afternoon, and Sunday morning. Sharon and I, the only two speakers, will be talking on the theme, The Gates of Hell. It's a catchy phrase. What's it mean? Why is it important? Where is it? And are we still trying to open them today? If you want to find out more and join us, please contact His Call Ministries, their website, hiscallministries.com, hiscallministries.com. The Go Therefore Conference, late July, will be at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville, Ohio. That's suburban Dayton. We hope you can join us there. We'll be there with Joe Ardis Horn, L.A. Marzulli, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Greg Reed, Pastor Carl Gallups, and Dr. Judd Burton. Man, this is a lineup. This will be an epic conference. July 26th and 27th, the Harvest Revival Center, a wonderful facility. We look forward to seeing you there. If you can't be there, do sign up for the streaming video because that will be available that weekend. And yeah, this will be one for the record books, getting this crew together. None of us is getting any younger, so every time we can do this now, we're just very, very thankful and appreciative of the opportunity, and we hope you take advantage of it and join us there. Be in Valley City, North Dakota for the Pitchfork and Hoe gathering again this year, September 6th and 7th of 2024. I will share more details as I get more, and you'll find out more about that and about our upcoming tour of Israel next spring, the Iron and Myth Tour of Israel with Timothy Alberino playing the part of Brian Godawa, Doug Van Dorn and Judd Burton joining us March 25th through April 3rd with an optional 3-day extension to Jordan. Obviously, the situation on the ground there will affect things. It is looking ever more likely that the war will expand to a ground war in southern Lebanon. If that happens, things may take until the end of the year or even later to resolve, but we will always have the latest information at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Again, we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, wherever that may be. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and then download our free app. If you're listening, whether it's Apple Podcast, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever else you find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold, please give us a like and a nice review. We sure appreciate that. We are indebted to our inimitable announcer, DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Good night, Oliver, wherever you are. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.